last we met, we were looking at our good dead friend David Hume, talking about religion and stuff. Before pressing on to more Hume stuff, any stuff about previous stuff that needs more stuff. Now, Hume lays out 5 problems in his dialogues concerning religion. He has the characters of Philo, Cleanthes, and Nemea battling it out, with Philo being the winner. And with all philosophical dialogues, you can always tell the character that represents the view of the writer, and that's the one that wins, and the coolest one, and the one that looks the best. Now, what he's considering here are the following sorts of arguments, namely the argument that there must be as much reality in the cause as the effect, which is the Cartesian argument. Descartes said, well, essentially I've got this idea of God. It's like a really real idea, super real, and so whatever caused that has got to be as real as the idea of God, if not more so. Then, therefore, he concludes God exists because the idea of God is so awesome. Then there has to be a God that caused that. And Hume takes issue with that sort of reasoning on 5 grounds. First problem is this. And his end result, even though he's often accused of being an atheist, his view is essentially skepticism and agnosticism, because he never actually says definitively there is no God. He says essentially all the arguments fail. The first problem he sees is this, and essentially he's using a fairly good scientific method. He says, first problem, a finite effect does not justify inferring an infinite cause. So essentially what he's saying is that if you look at the universe, it doesn't justify inferring, no, we just put it a clearer way. He essentially is saying that since the universe is finite, which could be mistaken, that we can't infer there's an infinite cause for it. Presumably a finite cause would suffice. Now, one way to counter that, of course, is, well, is the universe actually finite? Does it have a boundary? Well, we don't know. One thing is, you can tell when something's got a boundary because you run into the walls. But the challenge of knowing doesn't have no boundaries, well, you have to keep going for forever. In a way, unless you can find some sort of way of just knowing this, you'd never be able to confirm it empirically because you can always say maybe there's a wall up ahead. Second argument, he claims that we can't assume the Creator is perfect because we have no reason to believe the universe is perfect. We have no standard by which to compare universes, so we really can't say whether it's perfect or not. And so the problem there is that if we go with the inference, the cause must be as great as the effect, and Hume essentially is saying, well, the universe doesn't appear to be perfect, so we don't actually need to postulate a perfect cause. Or so it goes. Thirdly, even if we do assume that the world is as good as it could be, we need not infer that the Creator is perfect. Essentially it says, maybe God's had a lot of practice. To use an analogy that Hume doesn't use, if we see, so I was going to say pixel dust, but we have no pixels, so it must be expo dust, the most deadly type of dust there is. Now, to use an analogy that Hume doesn't use, if we take, for example, like Rembrandt or Michelangelo or other great artists, at their prime, we wouldn't say, well, they've always been that way. We'd say they probably had a lot of practice. So his argument is, even the university is pretty awesome, it doesn't mean that God is perfect. He might have had to construct like many, many, many universes to get to this level of skill. Fourth, if we go with the human analogy of constructing things, he infers that what we should infer from such a big and impressive universe is not that there's one God, but that there are many gods. So, for example, to use his analogy, if you came across a building like this, would you think, wow, that one guy who built it, he must have been pretty awesome? No, we think a lot of people, the normal inference would be a lot of people working on it. So the natural inference would be, well, the polytheistic view, lots of gods working on it. And lastly, he says, if we draw an analogy between humans and God about constructing stuff, then it seemed to follow the creator of a physical universe is a physical being. And so he says for these 5 reasons, not that God doesn't exist, but that the inference from what we get to a perfect being is unjustified. Now, is he right about that? Can we infer a perfect being from an imperfect universe? Would that be a legitimate inference?
Logically.
Yeah, probably not. I mean, to use like an analogy he doesn't use, imagine someone came in to you and said, I'm a perfect student. Okay. And you look at their, you say, well, what kind of grades did you get? Straight C's. And you're like, you don't seem to be perfect. But I really am a perfect student. I just do C work. So I think I understand what that term means. Yeah, so it doesn't prove that God is not perfect. Because you could have a student who is a perfect student who just decides to get C's for every reason. But the usual inference is you go from the result, and if you look at what probably caused that, you probably wouldn't go beyond what you've got. So Hume seems to be right. We can't infer a perfect being from an imperfect universe. Now, Hume does not end up as an atheist, because he, sort of ironically, he doesn't believe because of skepticism, but he also doesn't believe with disbelief with certainty, also because of skepticism. Now, in terms of his own religious background, he was raised in a Calvinist family, but gave up religion early on. Later, when Hume was old and dying, he was visited by James Boswell, the famous biographer of Samuel Johnson. And even today, people use the expression, like this person's, someone's Boswell. And that's someone who's writing, really like a big fan of yours, who writes about you. And Boswell asked Hume, did he believe in an afterlife or not? And Hume said, well, it's possible that if you put a piece of coal on the fire that it wouldn't burn, but he thinks it's unlikely that he would exist forever. And so we believe that the end was the end. Also impacting this was his view of causation. He took the view that everything seems entirely loose and separate. The reason for this is that if we go back to his view of causation, empirically we never see the necessary connection. We just see one thing followed by another. And he gave rise to what's now known as the problem of induction, namely going beyond what you observed to what you haven't observed, and things can always go wrong. And things go wrong often enough that it still doesn't bite. Namely, to give a couple examples, one obvious is in surveys and polls. If you survey people, you can take examples from the upcoming elections. You could have someone like Trump ahead in the polls, and you predict he's probably going to win the primary, but he may end up losing. And that wouldn't be, people would be sort of dismayed, but they wouldn't be shocked and think that was impossible. Similarly, if you're doing an experiment, you may get the same results a few times, but the next time it may not work. And you may think, well, the previous ones were just coincidence. Now, Hume extends this not just, well, we could be wrong, to we could always potentially be wrong. What happened before may not happen again. Because he empirically says, and he's right, we can never see the necessary connection. Just because something happened before doesn't mean it's going to happen again. Now, because of this, he ends up in agnosticism. Why? Well, because you can't be confident that God does exist, but you can't be confident that he doesn't, because you have no confidence whatsoever. So it ends up, sort of interesting enough, his lack of confidence leads to a lack of belief, but not a certainty that he should have a lack of belief. So it ends up being essentially agnostic. Now, this problem has plagued science ever since. How can we be sure when we work out all those wonderful formulas and calculations, we're confident that they're always going to work? If you talk to engineers and physicists, they're like, oh yes, this is always going to work. But then if you ask, well, how do we know for sure it's going to work? There's no, all we can say is it's worked before. Might it betray us tomorrow? It might indeed. Now, he also considered miracles. Back in Hume's time and a bit before, there was actually, back before they had things like sports stadiums and Disneyland, one of the main tourist attractions, interestingly enough, was religious tourism. I mean, people today still do this. They'll go to places like Jerusalem or, Mecca and visit there, spend lots of money. And so, back in Hume's time, pretty much any village or town that could make some sort of claim about a saint or miracle would do so, because people would flock there. And the cynical would say they would come there with lots of money, and it would be a real boon for the town. And so Hume wrote about several of these supposed miracles. Common ones would be things like, one would be sort of the classic one of the statues, crying blood, or miracle cures, or the appearance of an angel, or Mary, for example. Now, Hume had a very straightforward approach to miracles, which is this. He says, our beliefs should match the evidence. And so what we should do is go with what is most probable. Now, he used the notion of burden of proof. And the idea is that if someone claims something out of the ordinary, the burden of proof is on them. And he's willing to accept. I mean, he puts forth like a reasonable view. If they can prove a miracle, you have to accept it. But he says you go whichever is most probable. And what we know is that people lie. We know that to be true. Now, so if the only evidence we have for a supposed miracle that's bringing lots of pilgrims in with their money, that some people claim this happened, well, which is more likely? That the statue miraculously cured someone with blindness, or people are lying? Well, we know for a fact people lie. That's well established. Is it established that statues can cure blindness? No. So he says the reasonable inference is people are lying. And of course, we could still apply the same thing today, to extraordinary events. So if people claim to have like some sort of miracle, power, or seen something, some monster, well, which is more likely? We have a Loch Ness monster that no one can find, but it's still hanging out, or people are lying. And you would say people are lying, or misseeing it, perhaps, to be fair. Now, he is willing to accept that, given our observations, there is probably something remotely like human intelligence that orders the universe. But that's about as far as he's willing to go. Basically, there may be something that's kind of like us, that's intelligent, that's kind of maybe caused or is running things. But beyond that, he's not willing to commit. He does, however, end with a mystery passage, where he says this. He says, to be a philosophical skeptic is, and a man of letters, the first and most essential step towards being a sound, believing Christian. Now, the reason why the passage is something of a mystery is, excuse me, just not used to that expo dust. Probably would kill me. Better make it my will. I'll leave everybody A's. Oh no, that'd be a bad idea. Now, one interpretation is that even though he himself was not a believer, that skepticism does leave room for faith by showing the limits of reason, that reason cannot definitively show that God doesn't exist, and so faith can guide one towards belief. The other interpretation is that in order to be a Christian, you've got to be a skeptic, because if you accept knowledge, you can't accept faith. So since we don't know, like he didn't put like a wink or smiley face at the end of it, we don't know what his tone was. So one possibility is he's leaving the door open for faith. We can't, if we're skeptical, we can't know for sure, so you can believe based on faith. The other is, well, the only way you can believe this is if you just reject knowledge. So one is like faith's okay, and the other is faith is not okay. And so we don't know, because he's dead. So what was the end results for our good friend Dave? Well, his end result in many ways was skepticism. He, as we saw, he claims that reason cannot prove even our most fundamental beliefs. You know, he distrusts the senses, he says personal identity is a matter of grammar, and goes through all this and pretty much says, embraces complete skepticism. So, he ends up, in terms of the skeptical view, we have no foundation for any of those beliefs. So, skepticism. But he takes a practical approach, as we saw. He claims that there's actually no need to prove those beliefs in order for them to be useful. That essentially what he says will happen is we may have all these crazy doubts, you know, when we're up in a philosophy class talking about them, but as soon as we get outside, we lose all skepticism. You know, if you don't, you know, to use a standard example, in the classroom you're thinking, I wonder if buses exist and won't exist. But when you're walking out, you know, when you're leaving class and you're on the other side of the road, you don't wonder if the bus exists or not, you stop, because you're pretty sure the bus is there. Or someone when it comes to bills, you know, in class you wonder, I wonder if there are other people. But when the bills are there, you don't say, I wonder if Comcast or the IRS exists. So it takes a very practical approach to it, that essentially we can have skepticism, philosophically, but in practical life, we end up, not doing that. So, where does he end up? Well, sort of matching up against our other good dead friends, Descartes wanted to achieve certainty. He believed to know, he had to be certain, and he believed that he achieved it. Locke said, well, certainty is not possible, but practical certainty, good enough is possible. And Locke believed he achieved that. Now, Hume starts out hoping for certainty, but he ends up with a view that it's not possible. So in the end, Hume ends up with a view, we can't know things. But he says it really doesn't matter, because when you get back, when you stop talking about it, you just revert to your natural inclinations. So don't worry, be happy. And that's Hume. And then he died, and he's still dead today. Except that one day a year he comes back on Hume Day. But we're moving to our last dead guy, our good dead friend Immanuel Kant. Anything about the Hume stuff that needs more stuff? A little background for Kant. He was born in Königsberg, East Prussia, on April 22nd, 1724. And so next Friday is his birthday. They actually do have apparently they still have a Kant festival there, where they do, I guess, Kantian things. And since it's in Prussia, I assume they have lots of sausage and beer, or lots of beer. He was born into a pietist family. And pietism, or pietism, is a very severe, strict sect of Protestantism, where they emphasize faith and religious feelings over theology and reason. And sort of ironically, he ends up being extremely rational. He went to the University of Königsberg, later became a professor. He was about 5 feet tall, frail and thin, and he was one of those people that knew a great deal about the events of his time and geography, but apparently the furthest he ever went from his home, or the farthest, was 60 miles, which in those days was still a decent distance. He helped his brothers and sisters financially, but apparently wasn't too close to them. And one of the main things he was known for was extreme order. Apparently, the locals would set their watches by his walks. And there's a story, it may not be true, but there's a story that one day he didn't go on his walk. So the people in the town ran to his house, worried that something terrible would happen to him. And he found out he was reading a book and they had got distracted. But he promised them he would always do his walk at the correct time after that. And apparently you can still go there. If you want to walk the Philosopher's Walk, you can go there and walk that. And probably get some beer along the way. And it'll be the Philosopher's Stagger, maybe some vomiting. Actually, apparently, Kant wasn't much of a drinker, but Hume was. So Kant would have the Philosopher's Walk, Hume would have the Philosopher's Stagger, pass out, hangover. He died on February 12th, 1804, and is of course still dead. He contributed a great deal to philosophy. Works in metaphysics, logic, aesthetics, theology, math, physics, geography, and anthropology. And people who make their living talking about Kant claim that he revolutionized philosophy. So much so that they claim that philosophy divides into pre-Kant and post-Kant. And colleagues of mine who specialize in Kant, that's what they say. They're totally wrong, but that's what they say. You know, they are fine people, but they're entitled to their beliefs, however wrong they may be. So what was he trying to do? Well, like the other dead guys during this time, he was trying to solve all these problems. Now, in terms of his background, he was influenced by our good dead friend Leibniz. He was influenced particularly by a fellow named Christian Wolff. It's kind of a cool name, Wolff. I was thinking of Pulp Fiction, the character of the Wolf. Christian Wolff, 1679 to 1754, considered a very average thinker, but he was fairly influential during the time and apparently influenced Immanuel Kant. So what happened to Kant? Well, he was going along, basically being a Leibnizian and walking along, and then he discovered David Hume. And according to the story, he read the works of David Hume, and they awoke him from his dogmatic slumbers. As one of my professors said, so he could be dogmatic while he was awake, which shows why philosophers shouldn't be comedians, because that's the best line I would get. Actually, Steve Martin, philosopher, comedian, and Stephen Colbert was going to be a philosophy major, but went into theater, so he still talked philosophy. So I guess the idea is you can't complete your degree if you want to be funny. I guess that would be the lesson. So if you consider a career in comedy, you know what to do, or not to do. Theater apparently works out pretty well. If you finish your degree in theater, you can go on to be an actor, but don't finish the philosophy degree. Or you can go to med school, like the guy, the Korean comedian, who was actually a doctor. He was in The Hangover. He was a real doctor, and he's a real comedian. And he makes more money as a comedian than a doctor. That teaches an important lesson. So. But anyways, back to Kant, who was neither a comedian, but was a doctor, but not medical. Now, he wanted to, again, solve all the usual problems. And he begins with a couple assumptions. Assumption one, we do know stuff. Assumption two, he believed incorrectly that Newtonian physics was universal, necessary, and definitive. That, of course, turned out to be wrong, although it lasted quite a while because we had the fellow Einstein came along and changed physics quite a bit. He also seemed to believe that Aristotelian logic would also be kind of the final word, but wrong on both those counts. So he had the following goals. First, like most of our dead guys, his belief was the foundations of science were shaky and rough. And so he wanted to clarify and improve those. Now, in some ways, Kant is, to use a modern political term, he's trying to be bipartisan. We have the empiricists and the rationalists battling it out. The empiricists say, whatever you know about the world comes from the senses. The rationalists say you can know things by pure reason. And Kant is, in a way, trying to get the best of both worlds. So he does accept, with the rationalists, that knowledge has to be universal, necessary, and certain. So he kind of accepts the Cartesian project. To know requires certainty. But he disagrees with them and agrees with the empiricist about the importance of perception in regards to science. He also agreed with Hume with the idea that logical propositions don't tell us about the world, but do tell us about the relations between ideas. Again, we take the usual, contradiction being true, contradiction being false, obviously, and tautologies being true. He thinks that those don't tell us about the world. So, for example, if you say it is raining or not raining in Toledo, true, but tells us nothing about the world. Now, he also agrees that knowledge begins with experience. but he thinks it doesn't end there. So, key assumptions. Now, his objective is going to be to clarify, provide a foundation for science. Second thing. Now, when he looked at our good dead friend Descartes and others, they saw a potential tension between their faith and the new science, the mechanistic view. And what Kant wanted to do, much like Descartes, was reconcile the two, to allow for religion, freedom, and morality. Kant, in a way, sort of following the mystery passage in Hume, wants to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith, or so he claims. So second task, the classic thing of reconciling the mechanistic physics of the day with morality and freedom and religion, which is also Descartes' project, making the world safe for science and faith. Third task, Hume came into play and created a crisis in metaphysics. Kant wanted to address that crisis. What is the crisis? Well, traditional metaphysics rested on the assumption that reason could tell us about transcendent reality, about life, the universe, and everything. Kant noted correctly that if we look at the sciences, physical sciences, biology, chemistry, physics, that their progress was not matched by progress in metaphysics. The metaphysics essentially was, in his metaphor, a dark ocean without coasts and without lighthouses. And so he saw metaphysics as a realm of shadow, which would be problematic. Now, some took the view, like Hume did, is that if something's about metaphysics, the thing to do is basically toss it on the fire. But Kant didn't want to do that. Why? Well, one reason is this. He claimed it's unavoidable. We can't help but mess with metaphysics. And he also claims not just is it unavoidable, but it also deals with important things. So, everyone's heard the expression about babies in bathwater, which is, of course, that you don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. First question on parenting test. You have a tub with a baby in bathwater. What do you throw out? A, baby. B, bathwater. C, baby and bathwater. Now, so he thinks just because some metaphysics was bad, we shouldn't reject it all any more than we would stop breathing because some area is bad. And he claims that he wants to explain the failure of traditional metaphysics and then work out a more limited thing to answer the important questions. And he thinks that he can do it. So he wants to reconcile physics, math, and morality and solve the problem in metaphysics. So, 3 missions. 1, foundation for science, the Cartesian project. 2, reconcile the mechanistic view of physics with morality and freedom, also the Cartesian project. 3rd, resolve the crisis in metaphysics, which is kind of a new project. Now, to this end, Kant develops a theory of knowledge and epistemology. And his work on this is one of the most punishing works written in human language. It is the critique of pure reason, which is actually a pretty tough read. Now, apparently the toughest philosophers to read are all Germans. Heidegger and Hegel apparently are utterly incomprehensible. I tried to read them, not in the original German, but in English. It was like, I suppose there's some good stuff there, supposedly. Now, one thing he's known for is presenting his own Copernican Revolution. Why that view? Well, here's why. The Copernican Revolution, the original one that it's named for, was of course this. All view geocentric. You get the Earth at the center, everything revolves around the Earth. Copernicus proposes a heliocentric view. You get the sun, and then stuff revolves around the sun. And it turns out, Copernicus was right. Now, what Kant proposes is a similar revolution, but not about the sun and the earth, that's been done, but with our knowledge. And here's how. The old view involved the following, belief. The problem was, how do we know that what's in our mind, our supposed knowledge, corresponds to the objects of knowledge? It's the problem of the external world. How do we know what's in here matches what is out there? And what philosophers tried to do was try to figure out basically the arrow going this way for the empiricist. What's out here goes into the senses, gives us an idea here, but this runs into the fatal problem we saw over and over again. Namely, how do you know this is what actually happens? You get an idea in your mind, how do you know it's caused by something outside? And of course the problem is, well, as we saw before, can you ever get out of your own mind? Can you take a vacation from yourself?
No.
See yourself. Although it would be kind of handy, that would be nice. I think that's why people invented the attempt at self-vacation. Through self-vacation through self-medication. It's not a good album title, I'll have to remember that. Trademark. Unless someone else has already done it, in which case, trademark violation. So, Kant points out correctly that can't work. And this kind of led to the disaster Hume ran into. This ends up in just terrible skepticism. If we try to take this model, okay, what's in here matches what's out there, we can never make that work, according to Kant. So, doom. So what's the solution? One solution is to be like Hume and just say, screw it, I'm going to the bar. Self-medication. Now, what Kant does, though, is that he creates a new model. What he claims is, it's not that our ideas correspond to the objects out there, that somehow they, transition in there. What he does is reverse it. It's not that our ideas correspond to the objects, it's that, according to him, that the objects of sense must correspond to our faculties of intuition. Put another way, what he basically envisions is this. The old one is, well, you can't know what's out there, a priori, because there's nothing to ground that. So what Kant does, he says, well, what if we take it such that the objects of our knowledge must conform to our concepts, to use kind of put it kind of informally, that roughly put, that we have experiences, but they're shaped, formed, ordered by what's in our mind. So instead of stuff comes from the outside and gets in, and we try to see how does this match this, we have it such that what's in here is shaped, formed, ordered by our concepts. And so what he claims is, this way we can have a priori knowledge because we can know about what's in our mind. Or so he claims. Now, it's kind of a weird view, but essentially what he's saying is that it's not that our knowledge corresponds to the objects, it's that the objects correspond to our knowledge. To use a crappy analogy, or two. The old view is, you get something in here, so the idea is you're supposed to know that what's in here matches out there. Turns out to be impossible. To use sort of a bad analogy for Kant, here's how it would go. He does think there's stuff somehow coming into the mind. We have experiences. But I'll use an analogy to Plato. It's like Plato comes in, and then the mind has a mold. It kind of stamps it. So the objects of our experience, roughly put, are a combination of our sensory experiences and then our mind, like that Plato mold, shaping it. Now, he runs into the problem of we can never know what's out there, but he thinks we can know the shape of the mold, because it's in our mind. And so we have no trouble knowing about that because it's in our mind. So that's what we know about. Again, sort of pushing the analogy. Suppose, we can go back to the analogy. You're you're sitting in a room with no doors, they're just monitors, and stuff is coming on, appearing on the screens. Now, can you know that what you're seeing on the screens is happening for real? Because you can't get out of the room. It can all be computer generated. But suppose you have stuff coming into your screens and you're recording them on your, you have a computer, you're recording on a computer, and then you're manipulating them with, programs and assembling stuff. Now, you can't know about whether the stuff coming in is real or not, but do you know about what you're doing with your programs in there? Yeah, so if you're, shaping and molding stuff with your programs, you know about those because you have access to them. Or to go back to my Play-Doh analogy, you've got the molds. You know what the molds are like. So you know about what's going on because you understand that mold or that program. And so, roughly put, that's what Kant is essentially saying. That we have the experience, and instead of saying, okay, the object is just kind of like popping into our mind, it's like we're getting like a blob of Play-Doh coming into our head, and we have all these molds and forms, and we shape it. And so even though we can't get access to the Play-Doh, we have access to all the molds in our head. So we're able to know those. Or to use maybe a better water analogy, it's like have you ever used Instagram? Like all the filters and stuff. Even if you don't know whether the image you've got is real, whether it's computer generated or not, you know what you're doing with the images and shaping and so forth and the filters. So you know when you apply like a particular filter like 1970s or blur or sharpen, you know what you're doing with whatever that is. And so crudely put, Kant would say, maybe you can't know whether the thing that comes in is real or not, but you do know about all those filters you're using. And so all that mental stuff is something you can know about a priori, or so it claims. So does that work? Or is it just a cheat?
I think it works personally, because it makes sense that whatever you see, you just formulate it to whatever you think. That's why everybody has different ideas of the same thing.
Yeah, it seems reasonable. Stuff comes in, we do stuff with it. Stuff happens. Now, this leads then to the question of what is reality? Because, on Descartes' view, there's supposed to be like this external objective reality that we experience, get ideas of, same with Locke. With Hume, though, with Kant, what's going on then? Well, he doesn't claim that reality is entirely the product of our mind. So what he thinks is the mind structures the experience. So roughly put, going back to my analogy, it's like you get an image, on your phone. You get it from the internet. Could be real, could be entirely computer generated. You don't know. But then you apply filters to it or Photoshop it or something, and so what you produce is, going with the analogy, is an object of knowledge. It's the experience, like the photo pulled off the internet, plus the manipulation. So as Kant sees it, the mind, basically takes in that raw data and then structures and forms it. And that would be the object of knowledge. So experience, for him, is a mix of whatever it is that's coming from out there, and then all the processing we do. It's kind of like processed food, in a way. This is like the natural stuff that gets processed and then ends up in your mind instead of your tummy. But probably bad for you. Probably has too much salt. Now, like the others, he does point out the obvious problem. We still don't know what's out there. So, problem. So then the question would be, how can we have objective knowledge if we still don't know what's out there? Well, this could be seen as kind of a cheat. What Kant says is this. If human minds have the same structure, then within human experience, it's possible to have objective universal knowledge. How so? Well, I should use another analogy. Now, if we take like color, we don't really know for sure like what's out there, because we see this as blue, but we know from like the sciencey stuff that blue's not out there. Blue's in here. So the question would be, how do we know like what color this is? And if I ask you like what color is it, everyone says, yeah, blue. But we know the color's out there, not out there, so it would seem that it's all in our mind, so it would be subjective. But we all agree that it's blue. Now what Kant would say would be something like this. Yeah, we don't know for sure what's out there, and blue definitely isn't out there. But our minds are all structured the same way. So I see blue, you also see blue, so we're having the same blue, as far as we know, the same blue experience. Our minds are blue structured for the blues. And so we end up, we can say, aha, the color is objective, even though it's in my mind, in your mind, in everybody's mind, but it's objective because we all see the same color. Now, of course, then there are problems of, do we really all see the same color or not, but that would kind of wreck things. So, reality then would be kind of the know plus experience, our shaping gives us our mental content, roughly put. So, it's kind of like a factory. Mr. Meat comes in, you process it, you end up with, a Slim Jim, essentially. And so basically that'd be like our experience. Meat paste comes in, we shape it into something like tofurkey or something like that, and that's what it becomes. So that's a pretty good metaphor. Paste in, shaped, baked, cooked, wrapped, and that's your experience. A bag of processed meat chunks. Delicious. Now, he thinks the mind does this automatically. So you might say, but I don't seem to be doing this. I just look at stuff and see stuff. And he says, well, yes, because we do it so quickly. We look at things and we're just automatically auto-processing it. Now, in support of Kant, I mentioned before, there have been experiments or studies recently with people who have been blind since birth. They give them sight, and they ask them about what's going on. And they do have to figure out how to interpret reality. So we don't think of it because we don't remember back when we were, a few days old figuring this out. But when people get their sight, and when they're adults, they have to learn all that stuff. So it makes some kind of sense. So what kind of judgments do we make? Well, one of Kant's big projects, and one that led to basically battles in philosophy that continue to this day, was over the possibility of what's called the synthetic a priori, which also would be a good name for it. Probably is. Now, one of the things that we've been looking at over the course of the course is kind of the battle over what can you know by pure reason, just thinking about stuff, and what do you have to learn from experience. And Kant lays out sort of a taxonomy of this that plagues us to this day. The analytic. Now, analytic judgments are these. They're judgments that are based on the principle of contradiction. We can go back to our good dead friend Leibniz, taking a similar view. So if you have a true analytical judgment, then its contradiction is necessarily false. Simple example, if you have a triangle's got three sides. So if you say a triangle doesn't have three sides, contradiction. Now where it starts getting weird, or weirder, is something we saw before. Leibniz claimed, the predicate is contained within the subject. And it's a metaphor, and of course people who are critical will say things like, what does that mean? I know what it's like for water to be contained in my water bottle, or meat chunks to be contained in my tummy, but I don't know what it is for a subject to contain a predicate. What does that even mean? Is it like similar to like word turducken, where you're stuffing words in other words? What is that? Now, they do with the metaphor. The predicate is contained within the subject, but a fair point is, as many have asked, just what is that? And there really is no super great, answer. Now, with purely analytic judgments, they are not dependent on facts. And it's accepted they don't tell us anything new about the world. So, for example, knowing a triangle has three sides tells you the three-sided figure is three-sided. Tells you nothing new. Knowing a bachelor is unmarried tells you the unmarried are unmarried. Nothing new. The second type of judgment for him is what he calls the synthetic. Now, normally I think of synthetic as what? If someone said, would you like some synthetic chicken?
It's fake.
Yeah, fake. You probably say, no. Although apparently making synthetic shrimp now, that's made out of algae and stuff. Supposedly it's good. But if it's good, I mean, because the reason why they're doing it is because of the high pollution of raising shrimp. And they say what gives shrimp its flavor apparently is an algae. So they're like cutting out the middleman. You see the algae instead of the shrimp. And so someday we might have synthetic shrimp. They're actually working on synthetic beef. They made that, where they grow the beef, chemically in the lab. That way a person could be like a vegetarian and still eat that sweet hamburger. I guess it depends on whether they're vegetarians because meat isn't healthy or ethically. So apparently the hamburger, apparently it's almost affordable now. Because the challenge is, being able to grow the hamburger cheap enough to make it worth buying. Someday at McDonald's you might have a Syntho burger and Syntho shrimp and Syntho chicken. And synthetic people, robot serving. It'd be a wholly synthetic experience. Yep, total synth. So what does Kant mean? Well, he doesn't mean that. He means something which is this. Synthetic judgments for him are judgments that tell us about the world. Why are they called synthetic? Well, not because they're artificial, but because they synthesize the subject with the predicate. And again, we know what it is to synthesize, chicken. It's, not real chicken, it just kind of supposedly tastes like it. But again, it's kind of, it's a metaphor. It synthesizes the subject and predicate. But a good question is, what does that even mean? Now, these tell us about the world, and they have the feature of, if you deny a synthetic claim or judgment, there's not a contradiction. For example, we can take the claim Donald Trump will be president. First of his name. If we deny that, is that a contradiction? No, because we know he could be president or he may not be president. You do the same for Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders will be president. It's a synthetic claim. If it's true, it tells us something about the world, but you can deny it without a contradiction. And same for Hillary, Kasich, and Ted Cruz. So, analytic judgments, the one we've seen before, truths of reason, synthetic, truths of experience. Now, we also saw two other distinctions. The a priori, left over there, and the a posteriori. And the difference is what? If you know something a priori, how do you know it? Yeah. Yeah, before experience. You just know by pure reason. Again, like a priori knowledge would be examples of, it's based on the principle of non-contradiction, and it would be things like, knowing triangles have three sides, or finding a triangle that's got three sides. Analytic judgments are a priori. You don't have to go and look, you just analyze them. The a posteriori, brain's starting to go. It's the fourth thing that goes. I've lost the other four, the other three. So you can't even remember. That's the first thing that, what was I saying? But anyways. Yeah, a posteriori is, after experience. Stuff you know, like knowing that Jeb Bush dropped out of the race. That's something we already know, because that happened. We don't know it by pure reason, we know it by, by experience. Now, we can kind of mix and match these. First, the analytic a priori. These are things that are known, by analysis, and they're known prior to experiments. And this is normally when we think of analytic or a priori, we generally think of them being essentially the same thing. Things like all bachelors are unmarried, or all triangles have 3 sides, or synthetic chicken isn't chicken. Second, the analytic a posteriori. Now he says there's none of these. Why? Well, because this is based in analysis, and this is based in experiments. So you can't have, there are none of these, he says. So, no. Next, the synthetic a posteriori. Judgments based in experience. So they're synthetic, they tell us about the world, and they're a posteriori, they're based in experience. Now, are there things like these? Things we know about the world from experience? Yeah. Lots of stuff. We know things like Jeb Bush dropped out of the race. We know things like, you might know the taste of the McRib, which is not actually a rib, which is probably good because a rib sandwich would be kind of biting into those bones. When I first heard of that, that would be kind of a dangerous sandwich, a sandwich full of bones. And apparently there's no bones. Well, no known bones in there. Now what he really wants, though, is the final one, what he calls the synthetic a priori. Now this is the point of great dispute. What are these? Well, they're judgments that are a priori, so they're based in pure reason prior to experience, but they somehow give us knowledge about the world. That they tell us things about the world. Now, Hume said there's no, he didn't use this vocabulary, but he essentially said there's none of that stuff. Now, what would be an example of a synthetic a priori claim, at least according to Kant? Well, one would be this. All events have a cause. Now, as Hume demonstrated, no amount of experience can tell us that. We can't, the reason why is because we would have to experience all things. And then there would have to be an end to no more things. Then, of course, that would be the end of us, so, yeah, so that just can't work. But Kant claims this is something that we can know, that all events have a cause. So the question to be is, so how does that work? What magic is this? Well, in terms of it telling us about the world, that's the easy part. If we somehow knew that all events have a cause, we now know something useful about the world. All things that happen are caused. But the challenge then is, how do we know this a priori? How do we know things about the world by pure reason? Well, that's the challenge. For Kant, sort of one of his big projects is trying to work that out. Now, as you might imagine, later philosophers, people like Quine and others, said this is all, this is a bunch of BS. Well, they said it more politely, but they rejected this stuff. And a lot of the battle from Kant up to today has been, can you have this? And many philosophers say, nope. And others say, nope. I guess it depends on whether you did your dissertation on Kant or didn't. So how does he try to work this out? Well, and what would be examples of synthetic a priori thingies? Well, first he considers is mathematics. He claims, we normally think of mathematics as being analytic a priori. Math doesn't tell us about the world. We can math the world, but knowing 1 + 1 is equal to 2 doesn't tell us about the world normally. But Kant claims it's synthetic a priori. How so? Well, some would say he's like cheating here, and others would say he's cheating a lot here, and some would say no, it's okay. Take it as an example. Do we know that 7 plus 5 is equal to 12? Now, normally we'd say we know this, but that's a priori, but it's analytic. We just, that's a relation of ideas. What 5, 7, and 12 mean. Now, what Kant claims is this: you can't analyze the concepts of 5 and 7 and their union to find they explicitly contain the concept of 12. So it's not analytic, it's got to be synthetic. But it's a priori, because we don't have to go out and look at 5s and 7 and 12, we can know it prior to experience. So his argument essentially is, it's got to be analytic or synthetic. It's not analytic because you can't analyze it, so it's got to be synthetic. You don't get it from experience because it's got to be a priori, a posteriori, so it's got to be a priori. So it's got to be synthetic, a priori.
Wait, I don't understand that.
Exactly. Yeah, it's real. What he says is, he says, look, we know 5 plus 7 is 12. And he says, here are the possibilities. It's either analytic, we do it by analysis, or synthetic, tell us about the world. It's either based on our experience, sensory experience, or it's based on reason. Now, we know it's not based on experience, because we don't, as far as we know, we don't experience, I mean, we see people writing numbers on the board, but we don't experience, we don't have empirical mathematics. So it's got to be a priori. So then he's going to just try to show it's synthetic. And we have two options, according to him, synthetic or analytic. And he says, no matter how you analyze 5 and 7 and plus, you won't explicitly find 12. No matter how you analyze it, it's not in there. So, since it's not analytic, it's got to be synthetic by process of elimination. Now, as you might imagine, not everyone buys that. Some would say, yeah, if you're going to stick with Kant's terms, they would say it's analytic. You take 5 and 7, and plus, and you analyze. If you know what that means, 5 plus 7 is 12. It's not synthetic. And Kant says it is. Now, that it doesn't seem to make a lot of sense is a view commonly held. So your confusion was spot on.
Okay.
You're thinking perhaps correctly about it. Another example, geometry. Now we know, well, suppose you want to take the shortest distance between any two points. What do you travel in? Yeah, straight line. Now, Kant claims this is synthetic a priori. And again, the same kind of reason. He claims no matter how often you analyze straight, which is a quality of the line, it does not contain the quantitative concept shortest. So now, crudely put, no matter how much you cut up straight or boil it or distill it or analyze it, you won't find shortest in there. But, he claims, we know the shortest distance between any two points is a straight line. We know it a priori. We don't have to go and do it through experience over and over and over again. But he claims it's not analytic because we don't find it through analysis, so it's got to be synthetic. And again, critics say this is just, essentially it's a cheat, it's BS, but he claims that it's proof there is synthetic a priori. And again, the reason why he wants this is he wants to read things that we know by pure reason that are certain and indubitable, but also tell us about the world. And people who agree with Kant, think that he solved the problem, and people who disagree think that no, this is totally problematic, or worse, depending on their what they think about Kant. So his goal is to try to figure out how we do this, which is a good question. It's one thing to say all this stuff, quite another to try to show how it in fact works. Now to make that happen, Kant developed what we now call the Transcendent Method. So how does it work? Well, the first part is this. Even though he likes empiricism, he rejects it as a means of this. Why? Well, because a priori. You can't have empirical a priori. Now, the problem as he sees is this. What the empiricists tried to do was go from specific facts to generalizations. For example, I observe water boil at 100 degrees centigrade. I observe it again. I observe it again, 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 again. Therefore, water boils at 100 degrees centigrade. But as you pointed out, all I can say with certainty is all the times I've boiled water, it has boiled at 100 degrees centigrade. What happens next? I have the habit that I think that it will boil at 100 degrees centigrade, but there's no way of knowing. And so, as Kant correctly concludes, empiricism can never establish universal necessary knowledge. You can only say, this has happened, this has happened, this has happened, this has happened, this has happened. And then we say, I think it'll happen next, but there is no actual proof. So how is Kant going to break out of that and get to necessary truth? Well, the Transcendent Method. So how does this work? Well, it basically works like this. We look at the structure of experience, and we find the formal features that are not limited to any particular experience. That yields to us the universal and necessary features of that experience. What would be a concrete example? Well, basically this test is this. Consider an experience, and ask yourself, can I imagine this experience without a certain structural feature? And if the answer is yes, then that's not, an essential part of that experience. If the answer is no, that it's inconceivable that you can have that experience without that feature, then it's got to be an essential part of that experience. For example, space. Now, can we understand our, say, scientific knowledge about objects and so forth without space and time? Can you try to imagine any of your experiences without time? Is that possible? No. So Kant would say time is an essential feature of all those experiences. It's a universal and necessary component of our experiences. Similarly, when we're dealing with the world, space. We can't imagine experiences, physical experiences without space. And he calls these, well, what he says is, space and time are not things we experience. They are the frame of reference in which we experience objects. So space and time isn't up there. Space and time is what we use to shape things. To use my analogy, they're like Instagram filters. The filters are not out in the world. They're in the phone applied to the thing. So time is like a filter. You have the experience, and time filters it. Same with space. Space is a filter. Too bad Kant didn't have Instagram. He would probably use that as an example. Would have posted a lot of selfies of him philosophizing. So in the case of space, we can imagine empty space with nothing in it. Just picture like emptiness. But he says we can't imagine objects without space. So he thinks space is a form of the mind that arranges things for us. So we don't actually experience space. We experience objects that we spatially structure. So, going back to my analogy, we have a space Instagram filter in our mind that we apply to, we have experiences, and space organizes them. We organize things spatially. Same with time. We organize things temporally. Now, what about time? Well, time is actually a pretty interesting one for Kant. Time, he says, is not a thing that exists in the world. Time is not out there. It's a form in which objects appear to us. Why? Well, essentially our mind creates time. Our mental states occur in a temporal sequence. Now, one way that kind of supports Kant is this. If time was something like purely objective, it would make sense that time would always feel the same. But, based on your own experience, does the same amount of time, can it seem longer or shorter, depending on what's going on? Yeah, if it's something you really enjoy, time seems to go by very quickly. If it's something pleasant, like a meeting, time seems to drag and drag and drag. Or if you're at the Atlanta airport, time seems to just grind to a stop. Atlanta. If you fly Delta, you'll spend some time there. Probably a lot of time. Actually, I have the entire airport memorized now. I've been there, so I spent so much time. One time my flight was when I was there for 9 hours. So I just roamed the airport like a wild, linking up with other feral travelers, forming a gang, taking control of the cinema and exacting tribute from from lesser travelers. Good times, good times. There was a time when air travel was fun. That is actually true. You probably heard old people say that in the before time, people look forward to air travel. And now you're just like, God, it starts with groping and ends with Cinnabon. I guess the Cinnabon's not so bad. And maybe for some people the groping's not so bad. I don't want to judge. Now, he wants to take all this stuff to get to mathematics. So how does he do that? Well, this is what he claims. Geometry, claims, is a science of space. And math involves processing numbers, and that involves time. So math and geometry are linked to space and time. And space and time are universal and necessary structures of experience, of how we experience the world. And so he claims that thus, math is a priori, but also synthetic. So it can tell us about the world. Now, an excellent question would be, why is that important? Well, one way to look at it is this. Even now, when we have like the sciencey stuff, and scientists are doing their sciencey calculations, we still have the question, can we determine what exists and what doesn't exist by doing that math stuff? And we do have, we have all these theories where they work on all this mathematics and claim this shows that a particular particle exists, or claims that strings exist, or claim there are parallel universes. Now, scientists are usually quick to point out, this is something we then need to confirm empirically, but it is an excellent question. Can you use mathematics to prove that stuff exists? And Kant thinks, yes, it tells us about the world. And scientists today would say the same thing. They sit down and do all this mathematical stuff, and they present proofs that things do exist based on the mathematics. Now, of course, they're quick to point out, but of course we have to go and confirm this, but the initial work assumes that math can tell us about the world. And that's one reason why it's important. And that brings us to the end of the stuff for today. Next time we'll go on to, in the remaining time, more Kant. So, deadlines remaining, exam 3, exam 4, quizzes part 4. If you haven't completed them, be sure to complete them by April 22nd at 1:59. And then the exciting final that covers all the things, if you need that, by April 28th at noon. High noon or low noon, your choice.